How many are ready for spring? Anyone answer that question? Okay, yeah, all right. So welcome. We know the roads are kind of crazy today. We appreciate you all coming out. Thank you for joining us online as well. Hey, there's a missionary from the 1800s named Anne Judson who was called by God to go to India. And she traveled to India with her husband and another couple. And God used Anne to do extraordinary things over in India. And one of the things that she's recognized for is God used her to translate the Bible to the Burmese language, and she wrote the book of the Bible with Daniel, Jonah, and the Gospel of Matthew into the language there for people to understand a little bit of the gospel. What a crazy legacy that is. But here's the thing. She experienced terrible adversity. You see, they had to take a boat to get over to India, and before they got to India, all their financial support fell through. Her friend that was with her had a child, and her friend died giving birth to the baby, and the baby died. Anne herself had a stillborn baby. And a little longer later, she had a son, and at 8 months old, her son died. Over a 2-year span, she went without ever seeing her husband, and her husband was put in prison, and for 18 months, she had to walk miles to bring him food and clothing because the prison didn't provide anything for him. She experienced terrible adversity. And my question for Anne would be this: do you regret following Jesus? All the terrible loss and the pain and the adversity that she experienced, did she ever wish that she would chose not to follow the Lord? The question we want to wrestle with this morning is this: what adversity are you facing? What adversity are you facing, and how do you respond when facing adversity in your life? When life gets heavy, when life doesn't go as planned, when control is gone, what do you do? This morning we're picking up in Psalm 142 in week 4 of our study on the life of David. And we know that David was a shepherd boy. He was the youngest of 8 sons. His own father didn't think very highly of him. But we know the Lord loved David because he had a heart after God's heart. We know that David actually was anointed to be the next king of Israel in 1 Samuel chapter 16. And in 1 Samuel 17, he gives a picture of being a great warrior when he goes and he fights the giant Goliath. In chapter 18, we saw this last week, that David helped us understand what a great godly leader is, as it says that he was successful at whatever he did in his life. We know that he served in Saul's court. We know that he helped serve over many of the army. We know that he did whatever Saul asked him to do, and whatever he did, whatever he put his hands on, he was successful. But we know that Saul, every step of David's success, Saul hated David. You see, Saul was driven by jealousy to keep the throne, to keep the kingdom, to keep the crown. And now we know that David is on the run because 6 times in chapter 18 and 19 of 1 Samuel, Saul attempts to kill David. And so what do you do when the most powerful man in the land, right, wants your head? And so David runs. And in 1 Samuel 23, verse 14 and 15, it says this: "And David remained in the strongholds of the wilderness, and the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not give him into his hand. David saw that Saul had come to seek his life. David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh." And so David knows that Saul wants to kill him. But so here we have the next anointed king of Israel on the run. He's a long ways away from the kingdom. And he's in the wilderness. Listen. What if the wilderness is the place that God will take you to do his greatest work in your life? What if the wilderness is literally the place in your life where God will bring you to remove all the distractions, to remove the noise, to face your greatest doubts and the greatest fears you have in your life? What if the wilderness experience is where God will bring you to a place where all you have left is him, and you have to decide if that's enough for you? That's David. That's the position David's in. Have you ever been there before? What adversity are you facing in your life? This morning we want to see 3 responses to facing adversity in Psalm 142. And the first is this: with an honest complaint. Look at verse 1 through 4 with me of Psalm 142. It says, "With my voice I cry out to the Lord. With my voice I plead for mercy to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I tell my trouble before him. When my spirit faints within me, you know my way. In the path where I walk, you have hidden a trap for me. Look to the right and see. There is none who take notice of me. No refuge remains to me, and no one cares for my soul. And here's what's wild. David's on the run, but isn't it interesting that David's obedience to the Lord led him to the wilderness? Think about that for your own life for a moment. That you being obedient, you doing exactly what God's asked you to do, could lead you to the most painful season in your life. And that's what's happening with David. You see, so what happens in your heart when everything's going great, but everything around you is going so wrong? You see, the wilderness actually allows you to question your identity. We know it's painful, it's uncomfortable, it seems like there's no way out. Anxiety is often high, depression is present. And David literally says, right in verse 3, that they've hidden a trap for him. So what do? Look at what he says in verse 4. David says, look to the right and see. There is none who take notice of me. Listen, there's a popular TV show, a reality TV show called Alone, and maybe you've seen it. It's got many different seasons where contestants are chosen, and if you're chosen, it's not a show that I would ever want to be on, but you get dropped off in the middle of nowhere. I've seen one season, it was negative 30 degrees at night. All right, they get dropped off. They get to pick 10 items on a list of what they want to take with them, and they're completely alone until they decide, right, they want to quit. We've seen someone on the show last over 100 days in the middle of nowhere before. And so when they hit the ground, they're all alone, right? The race is on to see who can last the longest. The first thing they do is try to figure out how they're going to take care of their shelter. Where are they going to sleep? Where's the protection? Then they have to figure out how they're going to find food. Is it going to be hunting? Is it going to be fishing? Is it going to be a little bit of both, setting traps? Like, what are they going to do to better survive and eat in this place that they are in? Now, for me personally, if I landed in the show, my first question would be, where do I find electricity? Would be my first question. Where's the closest meat market, maybe? Right? And where's the hot shower? Like, those are the questions that I would have if I found myself in the show. But these people are left all alone, all to themselves with their own skill sets to try to figure out how to survive in the wilderness of where they are. This is David. He is all alone. And no doubt he's worried. No doubt he's probably scared. And I wonder if God used the harmful spirit in Saul's life in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, chapter 18 and chapter 19 to empower Saul to want to kill David with jealousy in order that God might get David out into the wilderness so he can reveal himself to David and you meet him in a unique way. Because is God not sovereign over all things? Look what it says in verse 2 again. It says, I pour out my complaint before him. I tell my trouble before him. Listen, when we are alone, we often are left to think. Lots of time to think. We're often trapped within our own brain, right? Thinking and processing life and all that's taking on. And David literally says, I pour out my complaint before the Lord. I tell my trouble before the Lord. Listen, have you ever complained to the Lord before? What does it mean to complain? You see, to complain is to express dissatisfaction about something. And isn't it true, in our own sinfulness, we often love to complain, and we love to complain to the Lord, and we want to tell the Lord and inform the Lord of how bad we think life is and how we think he should change it. But here's the problem. Philippians 2:14 says this, do all things without grumbling or questioning. Do all things in your life without grumbling or questioning. And so is it a sin to complain? Is it okay to actually question God? Because maybe someone should be telling David, David, you know that the praise and worship of the Lord should always be coming out of your mouth, no matter what you're facing. I mean, David, you should have the worship coming out of your own lips. And David's like, yeah, I wrote that in Psalm 34. Then why are you such a spiritual schizophrenic, David? You see, we relate with him almost in every way. We can look at the Bible. We can go back to the beginning. We can start in Genesis chapter 3, where Adam blows it and chooses sin, and God questions him on it. What are you doing, Adam? Why are you hiding? And he says, it's this woman's fault that you gave me. And then he says, it's not her fault, it's your fault, God. Maybe you should just give me better gifts. We can jump one book forward to Exodus chapter 3. And we see Moses at the burning bush. God telling him, I'm going to use you to do awesome things. You're going to march into Egypt, the world's greatest leader with the world's greatest army. And you're going to tell that dude, let the Israelites go. And he's like, yeah, I can't do that. I don't talk well. We could jump forward a few books later to the book of Numbers. In Numbers chapter 21, the people are in the wilderness and they complain to the Lord. And what they literally tell God is this: we'd rather be in Egypt as slaves than be in the wilderness with you. And what does God do? God sends fiery serpents, fiery snakes to bite them, and thousands of them die. By the way, that's the worst nightmare for me, right? Dying by snake bite. No, thank you. Terrible. We can look at the life of Job. Rightfully so, humanly speaking. A man who was walking blamelessly with God in integrity, doing what's right no matter what the cost. And God allowed him to lose everything he had. His children dead, all his possessions taken. And he questioned God. And what did God do? God, at the end of the book of Job, puts him in his place. Listen, put yourself in David's shoes. You've been almost killed 6 different times. What do you think he would have to complain about? I wonder if David's ever questioned God, you anointed me as king? If this never happened, I could just be with the sheep right now. Everything would be fine. No one's trying to kill me. Everything would work out fine. Or could he say, you promised me the throne and the crown and the kingdom. Why am I so far away from the kingdom that you're supposed to give me? Why am I alone? No community. I don't have my friend Jonathan with me. My own brothers aren't with me. My own family's not here. Like, why is this way, God? Ever questioned like that? I think David has a lot to say. Look at verse 1 again. He says, with my voice I cry out to the Lord. With my voice I plead for mercy to the Lord. Listen, there are very many times in our life when we pray very quietly to the Lord. But this is one of those times when David is pleading with the Lord. It is a verbal, it is a voice, it is loud. I view him as yelling. Ever been there before? Verse 2 again says, I pour out my complaint before him. I tell my trouble before him. Listen, what does God want us to do with our complaining? We need an answer to that kind of question. And one pastor said it this way. He said, if we don't talk out our emotions with God, we will take it out on our body and our stomach keeps score. Listen, I think there's a level of us being real with God that is important. And I think complaining very much can be a sin, but I think there's a difference between complaining to God versus complaining about God. And David is the perfect illustration of that. Well, what's the source of his complaints? Where's he throwing his complaints? If you look at the verse, it says before him in verse 2. Well, I tell my trouble where? Before him. Like he's going right to the source. He's going to the one who can fix it, the one who can actually address it. Isn't it true that we often have questions for God? And we often just think about the questions we have. But here's the thing. If you think about the questions you have for God, you might as well say what you're thinking. Is it possible that God knows what I'm thinking? And if he knows what I'm thinking, I might as well just have the words come out of my mouth. Like I might as well just speak them. In my wife's 7-year battle with cancer, there were some times that were more difficult than others in that roller coaster of 7 years. And early on, she was receiving chemo, and her bones were killing her. Then there was nothing they could do. No medicine was touching it. She was in terrible pain. Even if she took a small sip of water, it was excruciating for her. And for me to sit there and watch her just suffer and be in terrible pain, knowing that the pain meds aren't even touching her pain, aren't helping in any way, it was miserable as her husband. And late night, one time, we got her to bed. It was after midnight. She finally fell asleep. I grabbed our golden retriever at the time. We went on a walk at the park in Holland where I lived. It was right next to our home. And I let God have it. I let him have it. Let me be very clear. I wasn't quiet. I was loud. I was yelling. I wanted God to know where I'm at and what I'm thinking. You see, God, you can fix this. God, it doesn't have to be this bad. God, the pain med could kick in. Like there's a lot of ways that you can step in and make this more comfortable for her. Why are you not doing it? You see, what was I doing? I was letting out all of my emotion watching my wife suffer. God, you feel distant. You seem far away. Do you even care? You see, everything in me needed to come out. And the truth is, we often complain, and the truth is, our complaints are often sinful. But the question I wrestle with is this: does God want me to be real with him? You see, David's letting out all the pain, all the questions. He's pouring out his frustrations on the Lord. And we see him bringing his anxieties to the Lord, bringing his depression to the Lord. Everything that he's feeling is coming out. Listen, I'm a firm believer that if I don't take my emotions and pour them out in the presence of God, I'm going to take them out on someone else, and it's going to go really bad for me. How often, though, do we believe that we can only come to God if we come in the right way? Listen, how anti-gospel is that? How anti-gospel is that? The gospel message is not a message about you cleaning yourself up to come to him. It is very much a message about how he can clean you up. And so it very much is a message for the messy, for the broken, for those who are hurting, for those who are sinners, to come into the presence of God and be cleaned by him. So here's the beauty of the gospel. It's always an invitation for you to come exactly as you are. And so what if you started every day with God in the exact place you find yourself in? Is it possible that God actually wants every single version of us? The mountaintop experiences, he wants you. The deepest, darkest valleys where you're miserable and you're angry, he wants you to come into his presence. You see, is it a sin to complain to God? I think that's an important question. But I think God wants every single version of ourselves and others that he might actually demonstrate his greatness and his graciousness in your life on repeat, over and over and over again. You're in a mountaintop experience. Isn't that so awesome to experience those blessings in life? Life's falling apart. I'm here for you. I love you. You're safe here. He wants it all. So is it a sin to complain? Listen, if your heart is to inform God, I think it's a sin. But if your heart is to invite God, I think it's safe. And I think our God is safe. You have total freedom in the gospel, in who you are in Christ, to go at God, to approach him in freedom, while all at the same time going in reverence with the fear of the God that you're actually approaching. He is a good God. What adversity are you facing in your life? And today we're seeing how we should answer that. 3 responses to adversity. The first is with an honest complaint. The second is with a helpless cry. Look at verse 5 with me. He says, I cry to you, O Lord. You say you are my refuge, my portion, and the land of the living. I love that David is being very clear with the Lord. Have you ever cried uncontrollably to God before? Ever been there? Uncontrollable tears. Listen, to cry is to shed tears as an expression of distress or actual pain in our lives. And so why is it then that we should place our tears at the feet of Jesus? Why should we cry to the Lord? Well, the verse tells us in verse 5, he says this, I cry to you, O Lord. Listen, the first reason we cry to God is because of who he is. He's the Lord. He has capacity to rule and reign over all things in your life. He has authority over everything taking place. So therefore, we come to the one who reigns supreme and has all authority. The cross proclaims that reality, that nothing is impossible with him. And so when life is heavy and the burdens are building, lay them down at the feet of the Lord. David says, I cry to you, O Lord. But then he says this in verse 5. I cry to you, O Lord. I say you are my refuge. Why do you go to God? Because he is your refuge. Listen, wherever God is your place of refuge. And wherever you are, you can find God's refuge. He's present. He's for you. He's always available. So do you realize again that God is safe? You see, when I go to God in my tears, I think this is the place for me to get my heart in tune with God's heart again. And I think this is an amazing way into God's presence. You see, the best way into God's presence is the exact place that you actually find yourself in. You see, if God is our refuge, that means he's created a place for you, specifically for you, to come to him and pour out all of your emotion that you're experiencing in your life. And he wants to help you process it and handle it in a godly way. And so then, if that's true, is it possible that Jesus and all of his lordship over our lives allows us to experience the terrible pains of our lives in order that we might bring them to him so he can show himself to us in a new way? Could that be? Could it be that God has purpose for all the pains we face? Could it be that God has purpose for all the blessings you experience? Could it be that God's behind all of it, masterfully working together to make you more like Jesus? You see, when we come to find refuge in God, we actually get to learn more about God's character, that God gives himself to you. He gives grace, he gives mercy, and at times he even gives us his justice, but he's present with you and he is for you. You see, David said this, no one cares for my life. And God is saying, listen, David, in my presence you will learn that I care, that I really care, that I want you here. You see, I think there's often a blessing that we fail to realize that we have in the refuge of God. And that blessing is that we fail to understand it, that if it's not for the refuge of God, we would all find ourselves in a position receiving the wrath of a holy God. You see, in God, we find refuge from what we deserve, which is his wrath. And in God, we find refuge from what we actually get. We get to receive what we don't deserve, which is his grace. And so does it melt your heart that God would give you something you don't deserve? Psalm 57, verse 1, David said this, "For in you my soul takes refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster has passed." Listen, there's blessing found when we hide ourselves in God's presence. And I believe from personal wilderness experiences that the invitation to embrace God's refuge is always available. I told you about going on a walk with my dog after midnight during my wife's battle with cancer when things were uncontrollable. What I didn't tell you is the second part of my walk with God. You see, the first part of my walk with God, I was letting God have it. I was telling him how painful this is and why, and questioning his goodness and his sovereignty. Are you over this? Are you for me? What are you doing? But on my way back, I said nothing. I was quiet. I was still. And God gave me this gift of peace. It's going to be okay. I'm going to be with you. He gave me the grace I needed for the moment. He gave me himself. He gave me confidence to trust him further. He encouraged my doubts. And although I've learned this in wilderness experiences, that not all my questions will be answered, but I know that I've got him, and he's the greatest prize. So I don't need answers to my questions anymore. You see, the wilderness is hard, and we love to complain about it. But is it possible that that season in your life might be the season where God does his greatest work in your heart? And I can tell you from personal experience of being in the wilderness, that if God shows up in your wilderness experience, rarely ever would you change anything in your history. What adversity are you facing, and how are you handling it? We've seen we can handle it with an honest complaint. We can handle it with a helpless cry. But lastly, we see this. We can handle it with a hopeful celebration. Look at what he says in verse 6 and 7. He says, "Attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. Bring me out of prison, that I may give thanks to your name. The righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me." Listen, I love that David is having a raw, honest conversation with the Lord. Right? It's very raw. He's laying out all his emotion before God. And what we're seeing, though, in verse 6 and 7 is a progression of what takes place in the wilderness. And here's what's true about the wilderness. Here's the thing. The wilderness experience in your life doesn't change who God is, but it drastically changes who we are. It changes every part of our life, the experiences do. They're painful, but they're also beautiful in some ways. And that's what God is saying. You see, the wilderness gives us a fresh view of God. It deepens our trust in God. It empowers our hope in God. And so if you can't celebrate the beauty of the gospel in your heart, something is wrong, because the gospel is not based on good circumstances in your life, but it's based on a holy God choosing to stand with you in spite of your rejection of his holy name. He's good. He's faithful. And so notice the progression again in verse 6 and 7. There's three words that stick out. It's the word attend, the word deliver, and the word bring. He starts out by saying, attend to my cry. God, will you hear me? God, will you please listen to me? Listen, we get to rest in this reality that God hears the painful cries of my heart. And it's okay for you to go to God and say, God, I am not in a good place today. I'm not in a good place today. Life's too hard. It's too painful. It hurts. And so I'm struggling. My confidence is shot. I'm not doing great. But yet, here's what we learn. When we go find refuge in him, we learn that God is the collector of our tears. He collects them. He holds them. And every time you go into God's refuge, you get to come in and you get to deal with your pain, and then he'll get to review with you old wounds that you have and how those wounds have actually been healed, and how the gospel has worked out in your heart and in your life. He says, attend to my cry. Then he says, deliver me from persecutors. You see, we know that King Saul in the background wants to kill David. And so because God has chosen David as his next anointed king, it is not David's responsibility to protect David. It is God's responsibility to protect David, and it's David's responsibility to go find refuge in the Lord. That's his responsibility. God has to rescue. God has to come through. Attend to my cry. Deliver me from those who want to persecute me. But then he says, bring me out of prison. David feels like the walls are caving in. God, bring me out of the wilderness, he says in verse 7, that I may give thanks to your name again, that I may worship you in a greater way. Because listen, there's something about the wilderness experience that empowers our worship of God. And sometimes God will lead us into the wilderness, into a prison, to experience him in a new way. But here's the beautiful part about God leading us, is that when God calls you into the wilderness, he will never abandon you, but he will always show you more of himself. Here's the problem. Many of us in the room, because of our own sinfulness and brokenness, we want to run away from God. We actually want to abandon him. And so we run to the wilderness with our own choices and how we live our life, trying to get away from this God that actually loves us. But here's the promise of the gospel. No place that you run, there's nowhere you can go and run, no wilderness you can wander in that God won't find you. He's pursuing you. And so go ahead and run. He'll use it to bring you to the end of yourself, and he will show himself to be faithful to you again and again and again and again. And so we're seeing this clear gospel takeaway, that God uses the wilderness to prepare us for the mission. You see, oftentimes the wilderness experiences, they're used to bring us to a place where all we have left is Jesus. We have to decide if that's absolutely enough. And that's what David's actually wrestling with. Hey, David, what if you never get the crown? David, what if you never get the throne? What if I change my mind, David, and I don't give you what I said I was going to give you? Are you good with me? Same story as Abraham, right? When I look at the Bible, it seems like the majority of the characters in the Bible experience terrible experiences in the wilderness. Terrible, painful seasons. But it also seems to be so evident that that's the time that God showed up in their life and did what only he can actually do. You see, God, we know here, is taking the next anointed king. He's bringing him in the wilderness to prepare whatever he has next for David. We know Israel wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. We know God went silent between the Old Testament and the New Testament for 400 years. You think those people were waiting for God? God, where are you at? They're born, God's silent. They die, God's silent. We know in in the book of Matthew that the Holy Spirit comes upon Jesus at his baptism, and then the next chapter, the Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil for 40 days. And here's my question when I read the Bible, and if you've read it cover to cover, you won't actually find the answer, but how long will the wilderness last? Like, that's the question I have. Like, when is this going to be over? And there's no answer. It just doesn't exist. And so, figuratively speaking, David's wilderness experience lies in the shadow of a greater wilderness experience. And that greater wilderness experience is where Jesus became our sin and died in our place. So please understand this. Before God ever takes you to the wilderness, he already took Jesus to the wilderness. Please understand that. And please understand this, that the Father did to Jesus what he will never do to you. You see, the Father abandoned Jesus on the cross. We learn in the Gospels that Jesus is nailed to the cross, and he says, my God, my Father, why have you forsaken me? Why have you abandoned me? He did it in order that you might find refuge in him. There's purpose behind the pain. There's purpose behind the hard experiences in our life, which then means the person who best relates to your wilderness experience is the one who went through the greatest wilderness experience, and he can show up in your face, and he can declare victory over your sin. He can declare victory over your doubts. He can declare victory over your frustrations, and he declares victory over death. So please understand, friends, don't be shocked when the wilderness experiences invade your life. Don't be shocked by it. But rest in confidence in the God who's sovereign over them all. Because if the wilderness exists in our life, and Jesus was the greatest wilderness, he gets to dictate everything we experience and face in our hearts and in our lives. And so the question then is this: will you worship in the wilderness? Will you worship in the wilderness? Look what he says in verse 7, at the end of verse 7. He says, the righteous will surround me, for you will deal, the last phrase, bountifully with me. Listen, over and over and over again, the wilderness experiences are meant to bring us to a place where all we have left is Jesus, right? But here's the beautiful thing. What you do now can prepare you for the next wilderness that's coming. The work you do now can prepare you for what God has going to allow to come in your life. The good, the mountaintops, and the valleys, right? Whatever that is, what you do now can prepare you for the next phase. And here's what I love about what David is saying in verse 6 through 8 is that anytime we come to God, it actually is an act of worship. So when I come to God and I'm coming angry and I'm coming hot and I'm addressing God, it actually is a form of worship. When I come to God on my face and I pour out my tears before him and he collects them, it's a form of worship. When I go to God and I need him to come through for me over and over again, listen, it's an aspect of worship. When I'm honest with God, it's worship. When I'm real with God, it's actually worship. And we do this, why? Because of how he will deal with you. According to verse 7. You see, he will be generous with you. He will be present with you. He will be kind with you. That's how he promises to deal with you. And so therefore, we can take anything we face right to him. And he declares victory over any wilderness experience you have in your life. Even if it takes your life, you know him, you win in the long run. And so he is for you, and he is with you, and he is your God, and he loves you, and he's confident in himself. And so you can be confident in him that he will be present with you no matter what you face. And so let's stand together, church, and let's worship the Lord, because he's a God who's over all things that we see and face in our life.